Days after my wife died, shattered and lost, I offered a homeless man half my sandwich. He looked at me, his eyes piercing, and whispered words that would change everything. Time for revenge. Your father-in-law will pay. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for that moment. I was just sitting in the park, barely holding myself together, when I noticed this frail, old man with weary eyes. Instinctively, I tore my sandwich in half and offered him a piece. He took it silently, then, to my surprise, pressed a crumpled piece of paper into my hand. "Call me," he whispered, "when you truly need a way out." A few days later, desperation gnawing at me, I did. We met in a quiet cafe. He was waiting, his gaze steady, almost unnerving. "I know they've taken everything from you," he said, his voice low and firm. "Work with me. We'll make those people pay. We'll take back what you've lost." In that instant, a cold realization washed over me. This was it. The chance for justice, for myself, for my newborn child. My name is Darren Banner, and to truly understand why I was sitting there, facing this mysterious old man and his haunting promise, I need to take you back. Back to where it all began, on the impoverished streets where I grew up with dreams far bigger than the leaky roof over our heads. I was born in a working-class neighborhood in the Bronx, New York. The smell of machine oil and the constant symphony of truck horns was the soundtrack of my childhood. Our small house, tucked away on a narrow street, had stained walls and a roof that wept every time it rained. My father, Tom Banner, was a handyman. His hands were rough and callous from years of work, but they moved with remarkable skill when he wielded a hammer or a wrench. My mother, Dorothy, worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. By day, she taught at a small elementary school. By night, she stood behind the counter of a greasy diner, the clatter of dishes and never-ending backdrop. Our home was cramped, a tiny living room, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms where the wind always found a way to whistle through the cracks. I can still see my father in his worn armchair, telling stories of his youth, while my mother sang lullabies she'd learned from her grandmother. They didn't have much, but they had me, and I had them. That's all we needed. From a young age, I learned the harsh realities of our world. I remember once accompanying my father to a mansion in an upscale neighborhood to fix some plumbing. The homeowner, a man in a glossy suit, looked at my father as if he were dirt, berating him for being slow despite hours of tireless work. I stood there, an 8-year-old boy, clenching my fists, my face burning with a rage I didn't yet understand. My father just bowed his head and kept working. But as we left, he took my hand. "Darren," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "as long as you stay honest and work hard, being poor is not a shame. Don't let them make you feel inferior." Those words seared themselves into my mind. My mother echoed similar sentiments, especially after a grueling night shift, her feet aching. "My dear boy," she'd say, her tired eyes still shining with hope, "education is the key. Study hard, and you'll change your life. Not just for you, but for us too." I absorbed every word. I swore I'd never let my parents bow to anyone again. I wanted them to live a comfortable life, free from the constant worry about every penny for medicine or electricity. I devoured my studies like a man parched in a desert. I was always at the top of my class, even in hand-me-down clothes my mother meticulously patched. I didn't care when the rich kids mocked my worn shoes or tattered backpack. Books, math problems, literature, they were my escape, my weapon against poverty. Every night, I studied under the dim light of a weak desk lamp, my mother beside me, checking my homework with a proud smile. My father brought home discarded books from his clients, stacking them in my room. "Knowledge is something no one can take from you," he'd say. But life, as I quickly learned, wasn't always about beautiful dreams. When I was 13, my mother fell seriously ill. Our meager savings vanished in a week. My father worked day and night, but it wasn't enough for her medicine. I secretly went to a grocery store, begging for a job. The stern owner looked me up and down. "A poor kid like you?" he sneered. "What do you think you can do?" I didn't answer. I just bowed my head and left. But that night, when my mother hugged me, promising she'd get better, I made a silent vow. I would never let anyone look down on my family again. I would work, I would study, and one day I would make them see us differently. At 16, I earned a scholarship to a prestigious high school. It was like stepping into a foreign country. Kids drove their own cars, wore expensive uniforms, talked about European vacations like everyday errands. I felt utterly out of place, like a fish out of water. But I didn't falter. I studied relentlessly, proving myself. Those efforts led to a university scholarship. College was even harder, but I persevered, graduating with a finance degree from a top institution. The day I walked across the stage, my parents were in the back row. My mother sobbed, unashamed. My father gripped my hand, his eyes shining with silent pride. "You are our greatest pride," he murmured. After graduation, I hit the job market, armed with an honors degree and a prestigious university name. I was confident, but the market was brutal. Rejection letters piled up like a mountain of broken dreams, each one a fresh punch to the gut. One recruiter looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on the old dress shirt I'd borrowed. "Where are you from?" he asked, suspicion in his voice. "The Bronx," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. He smiled faintly. "Thank you. We'll be in touch." I knew they wouldn't call. Then, by some miracle, an opportunity arrived. Sterling Group, a massive financial and investment conglomerate, accepted my application. I remember interview day, my heart hammering against my ribs as I entered their towering Manhattan skyscraper, all gleaming glass and polished marble. I felt tiny, an outsider among expensive suits and high-level financial jargon. But when I sat before the panel, I channeled all my years of relentless study, answering every question with quiet confidence. They nodded, took notes, and I got the job in investment analysis. The starting salary wasn't huge, but for a kid from the Bronx, it was a life-changing milestone. My early days at Sterling Group were a blur. I worked like a machine, early mornings, late nights, checking every number, analyzing every report, letting no mistakes slip. I needed to prove I belonged, that my roots didn't define me. Slowly, colleagues noticed. They called me the hard-working kid. Some even asked for my review of their reports. I felt proud, but the class prejudice was undeniable. Colleagues from wealthy families, Ivy League graduates, were treated differently. They lunched at upscale restaurants, chatting about Hamptons getaways or their family yachts. I ate my mother's home-cooked lunch quickly in a break room, tried to ignore the curious glances and whispers. Once a colleague, Mark, smirked, "From the Bronx, huh? How do you even get in here? Must be luck." I smiled, swallowing my anger. I knew I couldn't let emotions rule me here. Still, the job changed everything. I rented a small apartment and started sending money home. I'll never forget the first time I brought a new TV to our little Bronx house. My mother's eyes lit up, though she playfully scolded me. "Darren, you don't need to buy these things. As long as you're healthy, I'm happy." My father just patted my shoulder, saying nothing, but his eyes were brimming with pride. I paid for my mother's medicine, fixed the leaky roof. For the first time in years, I saw my parents genuinely smile more often. Every ounce of exhaustion, every condescending glance at work became worth it. I began to climb the ranks, taking on bigger projects, joining meetings with major clients. My boss, Mr. Harris, a stern but fair man, once pulled me aside. "Darren, you got what it takes. Don't let anyone hold you back." Those words were pure adrenaline. I worked harder, learned more, and became a key player. Colleagues started respecting me, no longer just the kid from the Bronx. But some still saw me with disdain. Roy and Bill Sterling, the chairman's sons, were a constant reminder of the class divide. Roy, arrogant with slicked-back hair, his voice dripping with condescension. Bill, lazy, always leaning on the family name. Both looked at me like I was a cockroach in their pristine world. Once, in a team meeting, Roy deliberately put me on the spot. "Darren, I heard you grew up in the slums, right? How does someone like you end up at Sterling Group?" The room fell silent. All eyes on me. I smiled calmly. "I got here through ability, Mr. Roy. How about you?" A few chuckles broke the tension. Roy didn't laugh. From that moment, I knew I was a thorn in his side. But I kept working, visiting my parents, bringing groceries and stories. My mother would hug me, praying for my safety. My father would tell old stories, reminding me that no matter how far I went, I was still their boy from the Bronx, raised in love. But then everything changed. I met Ava Sterling, the chairman's only daughter, Gregory Sterling. It was at the company's 50th anniversary gala. Amid a sea of polished suits and superficial smiles, Ava stood out in a simple green dress, a beacon of light. I was clutching a glass of orange juice, trying to disappear into a corner. I wasn't used to this world of yachts and European vacations. But then her eyes met mine, and a strange warmth spread through me. She walked over, her smile gentle, completely devoid of arrogance. "You're Darren, right?" she asked, her voice clear as a bell. I nodded, a bit flustered. I never expected Gregory Sterling's daughter to know my name. We started talking. She asked about my work, my financial analyses, and I was genuinely surprised by her sincerity. She wasn't like the others. No Roy's arrogance, no Bill's laziness. She was intelligent, sharp, yet full of emotion, as if she understood struggles I never voiced. Our conversation lasted hours. By the end of the night, I realized I'd smiled more in those few hours than in the entire past month. In the days that followed, we kept running into each other, hallways, cafeteria. She always found a way to start conversation. I tried to keep my distance, but her warmth was magnetic. We started meeting outside work, grabbing coffee. She talked about escaping the glamorous but stifling world of her family. I shared stories about my parents, our cramp house in the Bronx. I saw that Ava wasn't just a powerful dynasty's daughter. She was a free spirit, yearning for an authentic life. Love came like a gentle, powerful breeze. I can't pinpoint the exact moment I fell for her. Maybe it was when she grabbed my hand during a sudden downpour, laughing as we ran for cover, her hair soaked. "Darren," she'd said, "I love moments like this. No need to pretend, just being ourselves." In that moment, my heart knew it belonged to her. But I also knew this love wouldn't be easy. Ava was Gregory Sterling's daughter. I was just a kid from the slums. No matter how hard I worked, the chasm between our worlds seemed insurmountable. Rumors spread like wildfire. The whispers, the curious glances grew more frequent. Roy and Bill didn't even hide their contempt. Roy cornered me in a hallway one day, his voice like ice. "Who do you think you are, Darren? A slum kid dreaming of my sister? Don't make me teach you your place." I clenched my fists, struggling to stay calm. Inside, a storm raged. Then my worst fear became reality. Ava called me to a park near the office. Her eyes were red but resolute. "Father knows about us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said if I don't end things, he'll fire you and cut off all my financial support." My blood ran cold. I knew Gregory Sterling was a ruthless man. But Ava looked at me, fierce determination in her eyes. "I'm not afraid," she declared. "I don't care what they do. I love you, and I want to be with you." Her words melted my heart, yet filled me with terror. I didn't want her to lose everything because of me. I'd seen my parents live a lifetime in poverty. I couldn't bear for Ava to endure that. But she squeezed my hand tighter than ever. "We'll get through this together, Darren. I believe in you." In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I loved Ava, and I would fight to keep her, even if it meant facing the entire world. We decided to get married, defying all objections. When I proposed, Ava hugged me, tears streaming, a radiant smile on her lips. "Having you is enough," she said. But the Sterling family didn't agree. Gregory summoned me to his opulent office, a grand room overlooking Manhattan. He sat behind his desk, his gaze cold and piercing. "You think you're worthy of my daughter, Darren," he snarled. "You don't belong in this world. If you persist, I'll make sure you lose everything. Your job, your reputation, everything." I stood tall, meeting his icy stare. "Sir," I said, "I love Ava, and I won't let anyone take her from me." 2 months later, we had our wedding in a small, simple, but warm church. Only a few close friends, my parents, and my relatives were there. My mother, in a modest but carefully chosen dress, hugged Ava. "You're the pride of our family," she said, tears in her eyes. "Take care of my boy, okay?" Ava burst into tears, embracing my mother tightly. My father patted my shoulder, his eyes full of pride, but tinged with worry. Not a single Sterling showed up. They saw our marriage as a stain, a disgrace, just as Roy had once screamed in my face. Ava and I moved into a small apartment in the suburbs. It wasn't luxurious, but it was our home. Every night, with Ava in my arms, I felt like the happiest man alive. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. Gregory Sterling wasn't the kind of man to let things go easily. The storm hit just weeks after our wedding. One morning, Mr. Harris, my boss and longtime supporter, called me into his office. His eyes were heavy. "Darren," he said, his voice low, "you're fired. It's an order from above." I tried to intervene, but no one goes against Gregory Sterling. The floor seemed to vanish beneath me. I wasn't surprised. I'd anticipated Gregory's retaliation. But having the job I'd poured my sweat and tears into ripped away still felt like a knife twisting in my heart. I returned home, trying to compose myself for Ava. But she knew. Ava always knew. She sat on the sofa, her eyes bright with concern. "Darren, what's wrong? You're not okay." I sighed, pulling her into my arms, and told her everything. She held my hand, gripping it so tightly I could feel the pulse of her heartbeat. "We'll get through this, Darren," she said, her voice resolute. "They can take your job, but they can't take our love." But the Sterlings weren't done. Soon after, Ava received a letter from her father. All her financial support, bank accounts, credit cards, even her inheritance gone. "You chose a filthy pauper," the letter read, its tone cold and sharp as a blade. "You will pay for your foolishness." Ava's hands trembled as she read it. Then she tore it to pieces. "They're not my family," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You and your parents are my real family." I held her, trying to hide the fear gnawing at my heart. I threw myself into finding a new job, sending applications everywhere. But every door slammed shut. One recruiter was brutally honest. "Darren, you have a strong resume, but no one dares hire you. You've crossed the Sterlings. They have more power than you realize." I slowly realized Gregory and his family had used their influence to blacklist me. We survived on Ava's meager savings and small loans from my parents. Each passing day, our future grew dimmer. Amidst that crushing hardship, a spark of joy arrived. Unexpectedly, Ava was pregnant. When she told me in our tiny kitchen, it was like the whole world lit up. I knelt, hugging her, tears rolling down my cheeks. "We're having a baby. Thank God," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. She smiled, placing my hand on her belly. "A boy," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I want to name him Tony, after my grandfather, the only person in my family who ever truly loved me." I nodded, a surge of new strength coursing through me. But that joy didn't last. As Ava entered her 8th month, she began to weaken. She was often exhausted, sometimes fainting without explanation. I rushed her to the hospital, my heart pounding with dread. The doctor said she had a rare but dangerous pregnancy complication. "We'll do everything we can," they said, but I saw the unease in their eyes. I held Ava's hand, trying to stay calm. Inside, a storm raged. I couldn't lose her. I just couldn't. The day Ava went into labor, I stayed by her side, gripping her hand, praying with every ounce of faith I had left. Then the doctor pulled me aside, his voice trembling. "Darren, we have a problem. Ava's condition is critical. We may only be able to save the mother or the child." The world collapsed. "Save Ava." I nearly screamed, my voice breaking with desperation. "Save my wife, please." I rushed back to her side. Ava lay there, pale, her breathing faint. She seemed to sense something. She struggled to open her eyes, her trembling hand reaching for mine. "Darren," she whispered, "you have to save our baby. Promise me you'll protect Tony." I shook my head, tears falling like rain, unable to accept losing her. But Ava squeezed my hand tightly, her voice weak but resolute. "Let me do this for our child. You have to be strong for Tony." I collapsed beside her bed, sobbing like a child. Every second felt like a death sentence. The doctors made their final decision. Tony was born, a tiny but healthy boy, with clear, bright eyes, just like his mother's. But Ava, the woman I loved more than life itself, was gone forever. I sat there, Motionless, holding Tony in my arms, my heart shattered into a million pieces. She had sacrificed everything to give our son life, and I, helpless, could do nothing to save her. Ava's funeral was on a rainy day. I stood by her coffin, fighting to keep from breaking down completely. My parents stood silently beside me, my mother cradling Tony, weeping softly. The Sterling family showed up, too, but not to mourn. Roy approached, his eyes full of contempt. "This is the result of your stupidity, Darren. That child is a stain on our filthy bloodline." Bill stood nearby, smirking. "You should get out of here before things get worse." Even Gregory, with his icy demeanor, looked at my parents. "Your family is a disgrace," he spat, raising a son who dared to taint the Sterling bloodline. My father bowed his head, holding my mother's hand, trying to stay calm. My mother clutched Tony tighter, shielding him from their venomous words. I stood there, blood boiling, but utterly powerless. Deep within me, a fire began to burn, not of hatred, not yet, but of absolute, unyielding determination. I swore I wouldn't let the Sterlings continue to trample on the people I loved. I would protect Tony, and I would make them pay for what they had done to Ava, to me, to our family. After the funeral, I brought Tony back to my parents' small house in the Bronx. The apartment Ava and I had called home was now a painful memory. I couldn't afford it, nor could I bear to face those walls that still held her warmth. My parents welcomed us without a word of reproach, only silent hugs and eyes filled with sorrow. My mother, with her frail hands, cradled Tony and sang to him in the same clear voice she used to sing to me. My father quietly fixed up an old crib in the corner, the one he'd made for me 30 years ago. "Stay here, Darren," he said, his voice low but firm. "Family is for leaning on each other." But I knew I couldn't rely on them forever. They were getting old, their health declining, their meager savings barely enough for their own medicine and expenses. I had to stand up to find a way to provide for Tony and care for my parents. I started the job hunt again. I knew the Sterlings had blocked me from any decent-paying job in New York. So I took odd jobs, delivering packages, waiting tables, even working as a night security guard at a supermarket. Every day, I left home before the sun rose and returned when Tony was already asleep in my mother's arms. The little money I earned was just enough for Tony's formula and our utility bills. Some nights I'd sit by his crib, watching his tiny face and feel an indescribable ache. Tony had Ava's eyes, bright, gentle, full of life. Every time I looked into them, it was like Ava was reminding me, be strong for Tony. My life became an endless cycle of exhaustion and disappointment. 16-hour days, but it was never enough. My mother started coughing more frequently. My father, though he tried to hide it, couldn't conceal the back pain that plagued him. Money vanished into medicine, diapers, mounting bills. Once, I had to sell the watch Ava had given me, a gift she bought with her last bit of savings before her family cut her off. As I handed it to the buyer, it felt like I was selling a piece of my own heart. But I had no choice. Tony needed to eat. My parents needed to live. In my weakest moments, I questioned everything. Had I done the right thing? I'd fought for love, defied all prejudice, but the cost was Ava's life. And now I was dragging my entire family into this storm. Some nights, when Tony cried for milk I couldn't immediately afford, I'd sit in the kitchen, my head in my hands, feeling more helpless than ever. I missed Ava, her smile, the way she held my hand and said we'd overcome everything. But now she was gone, and I was left with Tony, a tiny, innocent child who depended entirely on me. An inner conflict gnawed at me. I loved Tony, loved my parents, but the feeling that I was failing them was unbearable. I longed to give Tony a better life, to let my parents finally rest. But I didn't know where to begin. I looked in the mirror one day and barely recognized myself. Dark circles under my eyes, disheveled hair, a gaunt face etched with exhaustion. Was this still the Darren Ava loved? Was this still the man who swore to change his family's life? But even in that darkness, a faint spark flickered. It was in my mother's tired but warm smile as she held Tony. It was in my father, despite his back pain, telling me old stories to comfort me. And it was in Tony, only a few months old, grasping my finger and smiling a pure smile, just like Ava's. Those moments reminded me of my parents' teachings: integrity, resilience. These are things no one can take from you. I knew I couldn't give up. I started seeking out opportunities, anything to get back on my feet. Extra night shifts, free online courses to refresh my financial knowledge. I didn't know how I would confront the Sterling family, but I knew I couldn't let them win. The vow I made at Ava's funeral still burned inside me. And then, that fateful evening, destiny knocked in a way I never expected. Through a mysterious old man, a crumpled piece of paper, and a promise that could change everything. I can still see it clearly. A dreary afternoon in the park. In my hand, a sandwich I'd bought in haste. Seeing that homeless old man huddled on a bench, my stomach tightened with a familiar ache. Without much thought, I tore the sandwich in half. He accepted it, his trembling hands contrasting with surprisingly sharp eyes that seemed to see right through my soul. Then, silently, he pulled out a piece of paper with a handwritten phone number. "Call me," he'd said, his voice low and enigmatic, "when you truly need a way out." I tucked the paper into my pocket, thinking it was just a strange gesture of gratitude. But when I got home, exhausted after a night shift, his words echoed in my mind. A way out. Something I craved more than anything. That night, I sat in my parents' small kitchen, the dim yellow light casting long shadows on the crumpled paper. Tony was fast asleep in the next room. My parents were in bed, but I knew my mother only slept in fits and starts, listening for Tony, while my father tried to hide the back pain he felt from fixing our leaky roof. I couldn't let them live like this. Couldn't let Tony grow up in the same poverty I had. I picked up the phone, my fingers hovering over the keys. Finally, I dialed. My heart pounded as if I stood at a fateful crossroads. The phone rang a few times. Then a calm, deep voice answered. "I've been waiting for your call." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I'm Darren," I said. "We met at the park. You told me to call when I needed a way out." The old man chuckled softly, a dry but not unkind sound. "Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 5th Street, 10 a.m. Don't be late." Then he hung up, leaving me with a flood of questions and an eerie feeling, like I'd just stepped into a game whose rules I didn't yet know. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit that subscribe button. More unbelievable stories like this one are coming, and you won't want to miss them. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe, an old place with worn wooden tables and the faint aroma of roasted coffee. It was almost empty. The old man was already there, tucked away in a corner, wearing a gray coat and a woolen cap pulled low. But his eyes, sharp, resolute, held my gaze. I sat across from him, feeling like I was about to enter a dangerous chess match. "Thank you for coming, Darren," he said, sliding a glass of water toward me. "I know you're at rock bottom, but I also know you're the only one who can do what I couldn't." I stared at him, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I managed, "and why me?" The old man smiled, a sad smile, heavy with memories. He slowly removed his cap, revealing a weathered face etched with deep wrinkles. "I am Arthur Sterling," he said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "The founder of Sterling Group, and Ava's grandfather." It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Arthur Sterling, a name that existed only in distant company lore, a forgotten legend. Ava had spoken of him, her eyes sparkling. My grandfather was the best person I ever knew. My father pushed him out of the family. I never imagined I'd meet him, let alone that he'd appear in my life at this precise moment. Arthur began to speak, his voice rising and falling like the pages of an old book being opened. He had built Sterling Group from nothing, with a dream of creating a legacy for his family. But his own son and daughter-in-law betrayed him. They tricked him into signing over his shares, slandered him, forced him out of the company. "I lost everything, Darren," he said, his gaze distant. "The company, my honor, my family." But he'd never stopped watching. "I knew about you from your time at Sterling Group. I saw your integrity, the way you loved Ava despite all prejudice. And when you lost her, I knew you were the only one with enough reason to take down Gregory." Arthur paused, then gave a faint smile. "Our meeting in the park? It wasn't a coincidence. It was my way of reaching you." I sat trying to process his words. Why do you trust me? I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion. Arthur looked me straight in the eye. Because you have what the Sterling family lost. Resilience. A true heart. You didn't bow to Roy and Bill's insults. You fought for Ava, and now you're fighting for your son. I see in you the fire I let die out. Then he slid a thick, worn folder across the table. I opened it, my hands trembling, my heart pounding as I scanned the pages. They were classified documents. Evidence. Gregory embezzling money, setting up shell companies to launder funds, hiding debts, manipulating stocks. There were records of suspicious accidents, sudden deaths, a journalist who vanished after investigating Sterling Group, documents showing Gregory bribing officials, rigging politics to cover up scandals. A chill ran down my spine, not just at the sheer scale of the crimes, but the chilling ruthlessness of the man I once called my father-in-law. Arthur explained he had gathered these documents over years, living in hiding to avoid Gregory's pursuit. The journalists who investigated him all disappeared, he said, his voice lowering. I stayed silent because I knew I couldn't fight him alone. But you, Darren, you have the drive I lacked. You have Tony, and you have Ava's pain. I gripped the folder tightly, feeling as if it were burning in my hands. If I do this, I said, my voice trembling, what will I face? Arthur met my gaze, unwavering. True darkness, Darren. Gregory isn't just greedy. He's a predator. He won't hesitate to destroy anyone in his way. But if you don't act, you and Tony will live under his shadow forever. Only by exposing him can your family have a future. I sat in silence, my mind reeling. I thought of Tony, the baby who lost his mother at birth. I thought of my parents, who had sacrificed their entire lives for me. And I thought of Ava, her smile, her final promise, protect Tony. I knew I couldn't turn back. This wasn't just a chance to seek justice for Ava. It was a declaration of war against a dark empire. I looked at Arthur and nodded. I'll do it, I said, my voice steadier than ever. Arthur smiled, a smile filled with hope, but also caution. Good. But remember, Darren, this will be a long battle. Once you're in, there's no turning back. We must be careful. We only have one chance. I left the cafe with the folder tucked tightly in my bag, feeling as if I were carrying a ticking time bomb. Arthur had warned me not to tell anyone, not even my parents, about what he'd revealed. Gregory has eyes and ears everywhere, he'd whispered. One wrong word, and both of us could disappear, just like the others. I nodded, my heart heavy. I wasn't afraid for myself, but I feared for Tony, the baby growing up in my mother's arms, and for my parents, who had sacrificed everything. I knew I had to be more careful than ever. Back home, I quietly hid the folder at the bottom of the wardrobe, inside an old box where Ava used to keep the love letters we wrote to each other. Each time I opened it, her delicate handwriting hit me like a wave, and the pain threatened to overwhelm me. But now, that pain no longer brought me to my knees. Instead, it fueled me. Arthur and I began meeting regularly, always in discreet locations, a secluded park, a small diner on the outskirts, an old, rarely visited library. He taught me how to cover my tracks, how to communicate without leaving a trace. Gregory's no fool, he said during one meeting as we sat on a wooden bench, pretending to be strangers discussing the weather. He has an entire network, lawyers, officials, even people in law enforcement. If we act rashly, he'll crush us before we can even speak. I listened intently, absorbing every word. Arthur explained that the documents he'd given me were only copies, internal records he'd collected over years. They were enough to cause a stir, but lacked the legal weight to hold up in court. We need the originals, he said, his eyes sharp. And we need living witnesses. People who worked for Gregory, who saw his crimes firsthand. But they're scared, Darren. They know what happens to those who dare to stand against him. I thought about the vanished journalists, the suspicious accidents detailed in the folder. A chill ran down my spine, but I refused to let fear take over. So, what do we do? I asked. Arthur leaned closer, his voice dropping. We strike from the shadows. Step by step, we'll undermine Gregory's credibility, make shareholders doubt him, turn public opinion against him. When the time is right, We'll deliver the decisive blow, the original evidence and witnesses. But first, we have to find them and convince them to stand with us. Arthur's strategy was far from simple. This wasn't a straightforward lawsuit. It was a long, grueling war demanding patience and cunning. A guy from the Bronx who had only ever known hard work and integrity, now had to learn to move in the shadows, conceal my intentions, and outwit an enemy 100 times more powerful than me. Arthur guided me into his world, a world of secret connections and meticulously calculated plans. He introduced me to a few people he called allies in the dark. There was a former accountant from Sterling Group, fired after uncovering shady transactions, now living under an assumed name in the suburbs. He agreed to help on condition of anonymity. There was a journalist who had investigated Sterling Group, narrowly escaping death in a suspicious car accident. She lived in hiding, but still held critical documents she hadn't dared to publish. And there were others, former employees, betrayed business partners, each holding a piece of the truth. These meetings always took place in secret, often at night, in places no one would suspect. I learned to vary my routes daily, to check for tails. Each time I left the house, I kissed Tony's forehead as he slept soundly in his crib and whispered, "I'll do this, son, for your mom." My mother noticed the tension in my eyes, but didn't ask. She just hugged me. "Be careful, Darren. I believe in you." My father was quieter, but I knew he worried for me. Arthur and I began building our plan. We couldn't sue Gregory yet. The evidence isn't strong enough, he explained. His powerful network would bury any lawsuit. To take down a predator, Arthur said, his eyes sharp, you can't miss. We have one shot, and it has to hit the heart. I looked into the darkness ahead and told myself, this is only the beginning. During a strategy discussion in an old library, Arthur said, we can't attack head-on. Gregory has too many allies. We have to strike from within, catch him off guard, and make him expose his own weaknesses. I nodded, gripping a book tightly. So what's the first step? Arthur gave a sharp, cold smile. We leak a portion of the documents. Just enough to stir unease, but not enough for him to trace it back to us. The press will be our first weapon. They'll do part of the work for us, putting pressure on Sterling Group. That night, I returned home and held Tony in my arms. He slept soundly, his tiny lips pursed as if lost in a sweet dream. I kissed his forehead. I'll do this, Tony, I whispered. I'll give you the future your mother dreamed of. Then I sat down, opened my old laptop, and got to work. Arthur had provided me with an encrypted communication channel, a way to anonymously send information to a journalist he trusted, the one who had nearly lost her life investigating Sterling Group. I selected a document from the folder, an internal report about a shell company Gregory used for money laundering, along with notes about suspicious transactions. I didn't sign my name or leave any trace. When I hit send, my heart pounded as if I just fired the first shot in a war. A few days later, I saw the results. A small article appeared in a reputable financial newspaper with a headline, Sterling Group, is there something shady in their financial reports? The article didn't name Gregory directly, but it cited figures from the document I'd sent, raising questions about the company's transparency. I read it in the corner of my parents' kitchen, feeling a surge of adrenaline. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer a victim. I was fighting back, but Sterling Group's response came faster than I expected. Gregory, backed by his formidable PR team, immediately held a press conference. I watched it on TV while my mother cradled Tony in the living room. Gregory, in an expensive suit, stood before the microphones, his voice as smooth as a seasoned politician's. These allegations are baseless, he declared, his eyes cold and piercing. This is nothing but a ploy by competitors to undermine the confidence of our shareholders and clients. Sterling Group has always been transparent and committed to its values. Roy and Bill stood behind him, nodding like puppets, but I could see the tension in their eyes. Arthur called me right after, his voice excited but cautious through a secure line. You did well, Darren, he said. This is just the first stone thrown into the lake. The ripples will spread, but we must be patient. Don't let them trace it back to you. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. They won't find me, I said, my voice resolute. But deep down, I knew danger was closing in. In the days that followed, the ripples began to spread. Smaller shareholders, those outside Gregory's iron grip, started asking questions. More articles appeared, digging deeper into the financial irregularities. The media began to take notice. Sterling Group's name appeared in headlines with increasing frequency. Arthur and I stayed hidden, watching from afar like shadows in the dark. Each time we met, I learned more about covering my tracks, sending information without leaving clues. My life was still far from easy. I continued working odd jobs, racing against time to provide for Tony and my parents. Some nights, after a shift, I'd sit by Tony's crib, watching him sleep peacefully, and feel a creeping fear. I was taking on an empire. If I failed, it wouldn't just be me who suffered. My entire family would pay the price. But then I thought of Ava, the way she held my hand, saying we'd overcome everything. I remembered Arthur's words, "We only have one shot." I told myself I couldn't stop. I continued leaking documents, small pieces at a time, like drops of water slowly overflowing a glass. A report about a secret loan. An internal email revealing Gregory's bribery of an official. Each document was a bullet fired from the shadows, aimed at the heart of Sterling Group. I didn't know if Gregory suspected anything yet, but I could feel the tension in the air. Once, passing a newsstand, I saw Roy on the front page. Sterling Group Chairman's son suspected in fraud. My heart raced. I bought the paper. It didn't mention me or Arthur, but I knew we were shaking their empire. Arthur and I met again in a small diner on the outskirts, where the dim lighting and sparse crowd ensured no one noticed two men in the corner. He looked at me, his eyes a mix of pride and worry. "You're doing well," he said. "But from now on, things will get more dangerous. Gregory won't sit idly by." I nodded, my hands clenched. "I'm ready," I replied, a formless fear still stirring within me. "I won't stop until they pay for what they've done." As more articles continued to be published, the atmosphere at Sterling Group shifted dramatically. I no longer worked there, but through the few old friends I had left, I heard whispers of unease. Shareholders started raising questions at meetings, demanding explanations for the suspicious figures. Gregory, with his formidable team, tried to extinguish the flames with polished statements and lofty promises. But Arthur and I didn't stop. We knew articles alone weren't enough. We needed a relentless chain of strikes, each one stronger than the last, to keep Sterling Group reeling. I began working with a small group of journalists Arthur trusted. They were people who had been threatened by Sterling Group, carrying both fear and determination in their hearts. One of them, Anna, had nearly lost her life in a car accident she believed Gregory had orchestrated. With her short, silver-dyed hair and resolute eyes, she became the front woman for publishing our documents. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," she said when we met in a small Brooklyn apartment where she lived under an assumed identity. "But Darren, you have to understand that once we do this, there's no turning back. Gregory will come after us." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know." Then one morning, I turned on the TV and saw Sterling Group's name plastered across every news channel. A major newspaper had released a series of investigative articles with the headline, "Sterling Group Scandal, Corruption and Cover-Ups at the Pinnacle of Power." The articles cited testimony from a former employee in the accounting department who had witnessed Gregory manipulating figures to hide debts. The person Arthur had convinced to come forward under the promise of anonymity. A media storm erupted. Articles sprang up like mushrooms after rain, from financial journals to national news outlets. Each day brought new revelations. A shell company exposed, a suspected bribe to an official, a major partner pulling out of a deal with Sterling Group over scandal concerns. The company's stock price began to plummet. I heard major shareholders were holding secret meetings, demanding answers from Gregory. On social media, the news spread like wildfire, thousands sharing articles and questioning the company's transparency. Meanwhile, witnesses who had once stayed silent began to speak out. Another former accountant, fired by Gregory for refusing to sign off on a falsified report, contacted Anna and provided more evidence. A former business partner of Sterling Group, betrayed by Gregory in a deal, appeared on a television program, publicly criticizing the company. And then something I hadn't expected happened. A journalist who had disappeared after investigating Sterling Group turned out to be alive. She appeared in an anonymous interview, recounting how she had been threatened and forced into hiding. These stories, each a small piece of the puzzle, came together to form a clear picture of Gregory Sterling's greed and ruthlessness. The pressure from public opinion became immense. Major partners of Sterling Group began canceling contracts, fearing association with the scandal. Panic-stricken shareholders sold off their stocks, causing the company's market value to plummet. Arthur and I remained anonymous, letting the press do its work. Each time I saw Gregory's name on the news, I felt a small piece of justice being served. But I also knew we were entering the most dangerous phase. Gregory wouldn't sit idly by and watch his empire crumble. He would strike back. And when he did, Arthur and I had to be ready. In the days that followed, news reports about Sterling Group dominated the headlines with increasingly sharp pronouncements. Sterling Group scandal. Is this the fall of an empire? Chairman Gregory Sterling faces pressure from shareholders and investigators. I sat in my parents' small kitchen, my eyes glued to the TV screen. I knew Gregory was hunting for the person behind the leaks. Once, I received a message from an old friend at Sterling Group, warning me that Roy and Bill were interrogating every employee and had even hired private investigators to trace the source of the documents. "Be careful, Darren," the message read. "They're furious." My heart raced. I deleted it immediately, leaving no trace. The major shareholders of Sterling Group, once loyal to Gregory, began to waver. They no longer trusted his smooth promises or the polished speeches from his PR team. An extraordinary shareholders meeting was called, and this time, it wasn't under Gregory's control. Arthur received word from an old ally on the board, a man who had worked with him in the early days of Sterling Group. "They're losing faith," he told me during a meeting in a small diner, his eyes gleaming with hope. "The shareholders want to act to save the company. This is our chance, Darren." We began preparing for the final blow. Arthur reached out to his allies, those betrayed by Gregory, to gather more original evidence. Signed contracts, undeniable emails, even recordings from a former assistant who had taped Gregory's secret meetings. I worked day and night, reviewing every document, ensuring no mistakes. On the day of the shareholders' meeting, Arthur and I stayed away. We couldn't show our faces or let Gregory know we were behind it all. Instead, we sent the original documents to Anna. With courage I couldn't help but admire, she passed them to a group of major shareholders and an investigative agency. As the meeting began, the atmosphere in Sterling Group's grand conference room was like a powder keg. I watched it live through a secret link Anna provided. Gregory stood at the podium, trying to maintain his composure, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The shareholders, usually silent and compliant, now stood up, confronting him with pointed questions. An older man, representing a major investment fund, held up a stack of documents, the very evidence we had sent. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice ringing through the silent room, "how do you explain these funds? The shell companies? The bribes recorded in your own emails?" The room erupted in whispers and stunned glances. Roy and Bill, seated beside their father, turned pale. Gregory tried to respond, his voice trembling but still laced with arrogance. "This is slander," he declared, losing his composure. "These documents are fabricated, spread by competitors to bring me down." But no one believed him anymore. Another shareholder stood and played a recording, Gregory's unmistakable voice discussing a bribe to an official to cover up a scandal. The room fell silent. The only sound was Gregory's ragged breathing through the microphone. Then, something I hadn't anticipated happened. A major shareholder, once a close ally of Gregory, stood up and proposed a vote of no confidence. "We cannot let Sterling Group collapse because of one man's greed," he said. "I moved to remove Gregory Sterling and his two sons from the board immediately." A chorus of agreement broke out, loud and resolute. I felt a rush of adrenaline, barely able to believe what was unfolding. Gregory tried to shout, to regain control, but no one listened anymore. The vote happened quickly. The results were announced. Gregory, Roy, and Bill were removed from the board. A temporary board was formed, pledging full cooperation with investigators to uncover every scandal. Gregory and his family were now under intense scrutiny. Investigative agencies swooped in, combing through every transaction, account, and email to trace the embezzlement, money laundering, and financial fraud we had exposed. I imagined Gregory's face, once arrogant and untouchable, now facing suspicious stares and unavoidable questions. In the days following the shareholders' meeting, the atmosphere in New York City seemed to tremble with the storm we had unleashed. The press was relentless, churning out story after story. Meanwhile, Gregory, Roy, and Bill were summoned before investigative agencies. I heard they'd hired a team of high-priced lawyers to salvage their reputation. But this time, no one could cover up the truth. The evidence we provided, emails, forged contracts, recordings, was too clear, too sharp to be dismissed. Another shareholders' meeting for Sterling Group was scheduled. This time, Arthur decided it was time for us to step forward. "This is our chance to close the past," he said, his voice low but powerful. "I'll tell my story, and you'll tell yours. They need to know who's behind all this." I clenched my fists, feeling as if I stood at a fateful crossroads. The meeting took place in a grand Manhattan conference hall, gleaming glass walls, an atmosphere as tense as a courtroom. Arthur and I arrived early, standing in a corner, observing the crowd of shareholders, reporters, and members of the interim board. Gregory, Roy, and Bill were absent, under investigation and barred from attending. As the meeting began, a few longtime shareholders immediately noticed Arthur. Though he had left the company years ago, and his name seemed relegated to memory, the legend of Sterling Group's founder still lingered in whispers. Suddenly, a prominent shareholder stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the hall. "Today, we are honored to have the presence of the man who founded Sterling Group. Many of you may never have met him, but he is a living legend among us. Please welcome Mr. Arthur Sterling to say a few words." Arthur walked to the podium with measured steps, an elderly man radiating dignity, his eyes sharp, his voice resonant. "I am Arthur Sterling," he declared, and the hall fell silent. A few people whispered, recognizing the legendary name. "I was betrayed by my own family," he continued, "pushed out of the company I built by my son, Gregory Sterling. But today, I've returned to tell the truth about his crimes, about the greed that has tarnished Sterling Group's legacy." He recounted his story, how he was tricked into signing away his shares, slandered, and isolated. He spoke of his years in hiding, gathering evidence, waiting for the chance to reclaim justice. The hall was quiet, the only sound Arthur's powerful, emotional voice. Then he looked at me, his eyes signaling. "But I didn't do this alone," he said. "There is a young man who lost everything because of the Sterling family, yet still rose to fight. Darren Banner, please come forward." I stepped onto the podium, my heart pounding. All eyes were on me. It felt like the world was watching. "I am Darren Banner," I said, my voice trembling at first, but growing steady. "I was once an employee of Sterling Group, humiliated by Gregory Sterling and his sons for my humble background. I loved Ava Sterling, and she sacrificed everything to give us our son, Tony. But the Sterling family took her from me, took my job, and tried to take my son's future. I told my story. My love for Ava, the Sterling family's opposition and retaliation, her death, the months I lived in despair. I spoke of our fight in the shadows, the documents Arthur and I had leaked, the witnesses who had come forward. I didn't do this out of hatred," I said, looking directly at the crowd. "I did this for justice, for Ava, for my son, and for everyone the Sterling family has trampled." The hall erupted in applause. Tears streamed down my cheeks, not from sadness, but because for the first time, I felt I was no longer alone. The shareholders, once silent under Gregory's reign, now stood, voicing their support. The press captured every word. I knew our story, Arthur's and mine, would spread far and wide. We were no longer shadows. We were victors. I knew that somewhere, Gregory, Roy, and Bill were watching the meeting on a screen. I imagined their faces, stunned, furious, realizing that the one who brought down their empire was me. Darren Banner, the penniless pauper they once mocked. Arthur's honor was restored, and he was invited to rejoin the board as an honorary advisor. But he declined, looking at me with a proud smile. "You're the one who should lead, Darren," he said. "You have the heart and the ability Sterling Group needs." In a surprising decision, the board offered me a position on the new leadership team as CEO. I was stunned, unable to believe that a guy from the poor streets of the Bronx, had been recognized and seen. After my appointment, I moved my parents to a new home. It wasn't extravagant, but comfortable enough for them to live without worrying about medical bills or a leaky roof. Tony, my little boy, began growing up in a loving environment with better care and nourishment. My mother still told him bedtime stories every night, and in those moments, my heart was warmed beyond measure. Each morning, when I looked in a mirror, I no longer saw a broken man with dark circles under his eyes. Instead, I saw a father, a son, and a man who had fought relentlessly for justice. I had kept my promise to Ava, to Tony, and to myself. But more importantly, I wanted to send a message to everyone still struggling in the shadows. Hold fast to your integrity. Stay resilient. Never give up. Justice may come late, but if you keep fighting, it will surely come. What would you have done in my place, facing such an impossible battle? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.